today, and you read an article, should have read an article last Friday, and we went over some of the things that cause the depression, including problems in the banking system. And now we're going to get into some other issues that are problematic. And one of the biggest things at the time was the President of the United States. Herbert Hoover is the President of the United States at this time, and Herbert Hoover is really just unfortunate to be president at the time that the stock market crash occurs and the onset of the Great Depression happens. All right. And the first thing we want to mention about Herbert Hoover here is that, look, being president means you're going to take all the heat for this, all the blame for something goes to you, even if it's not something that is your fault. Okay. And that's it's like being the coach of a sports team. When things go really well, you get all the credit, all the glory, even if it's not your doing. And when things fall apart, you're going to be the one that takes the blame. And that's what being president is like even today. Okay, so Herbert Hoover is going to get all the blame for this. And we'll talk about some of his bad decisions, or we actually mentioned a few of them, including his response was to take money out of the system, decrease the money supply, and he also was the one who proposed tariffs, taxes on imported goods. And these turned out to be terrible decisions by the government, even though he believed he was doing the right thing. Now, he's going to take all the blame for this, but something that is definitely his fault is a disaster that we call the Bonus Army disaster. The year is 1932, and fun fact, 1932 is 3 years into the Depression, and it is undoubtedly the low point of the Great Depression. Things are going to be bad. We'll tell you just how bad here in a second. But here's the problem that Herbert Hoover had to deal with, and it's going to make him look terribly embarrassing to the public. And it's just another bad situation that Herbert Hoover has to deal with. Here's the problem: 3 years into the Depression, and a lot of people are struggling, including a sizable number of military veterans from World War One. All right, and military veterans from World War One, when they got back at the end of 1919, they were promised a bonus. Okay, and the bonus wasn't payable for something like 25 years. All right. So the bonus was to help them later on in life when they were growing older. Okay. So in 1919, when the soldiers got back, they knew that years down the road they would get a bonus for being World War One veterans. All right. Now, 1932, a lot of these veterans had been struggling through the Great Depression, stock market losses, bank closures, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes. It was a ridiculously tough environment. And so what happens is a band of these World War One veterans decide that they're going to try to get the government to give them their bonus early because of the situation going on. And what you see in the picture here on the screen is what's referred to as the bonus army. You get tens of thousands of these veterans, along with their families and friends, who travel to Washington, D.C. to try to convince Herbert Hoover and the United States government that indeed they should be paid their bonus early. All right. And they are lobbying there. And when we're talking about the number of people who are trying to get the government to act, uh, there's an estimated 30 to 35,000 people, including the family members of the veterans, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 18,000 actual military veterans in that number. So they're there, they're trying to convince the government to give them their bonus early. And Herbert Hoover, he decides not to give them their bonus. He and Congress decided that they just couldn't do that right now. It's not in the best financial interest of the country. It wasn't going to happen. Right? That is extremely problematic. But the bonus army, these number of veterans and their families, a lot of them just said, you know what, we tried our best. Let's go home. All right. But a few thousand of them stayed behind because they didn't have anywhere to go. They were homeless veterans. All right. And so what they did was they actually built a homeless camp in a nearby park to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. All right. Here's what happens as a result, though. Herbert Hoover and the government saw it as an embarrassment that there's a giant homeless camp of military veterans living in the nation's capital. So Herbert Hoover decided to dispatch the military to show up and take care of this problem, right? And what happened was an absolute nightmare, okay? You see right here, the military shows up and they set fire to this little homeless town, this little shack town that the veterans had built, and they forced them out. Okay. And what's really funny, if you look at this picture in the background, you can see the United States Capitol dome in the background. All right. And the military not only shows up in force with numbers of infantry there too, but they have rifles, they have fixed bayonets, and they bring in a couple of tanks for good measure. All right. So here you have the United States Army rolling into this little homeless town of military veterans, men who have seen action in World War One, and they're not only forcing them to leave town, but they're burning up their home as well. Okay. It's terribly embarrassing for Herbert Hoover. All right. And not only that, but dozens of people are injured in the removal of the bonus army, and two people die as a result. Okay. So Herbert Hoover, on top of the Great Depression, the stock market crashing, banks failing, businesses being done for, he's got this debacle of the bonus army. Also, what's worse, 1932 is going to be an election year for Hoover. And if that wasn't enough to destroy his chances for reelection, we want to mention some statistics from the Depression. Now, you don't have to remember specifics, but what I'm trying to do is give you an idea of what happens. From 1929 to 1932, the number of failed businesses is somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 to 300,000, right? That's how many businesses go out of business in that time frame, right? That's a huge loss. A lot of these businesses defaulted on loans because they had overproduced. Their banks had didn't have the banks where they deposit their money went out of business. They are struggling, and people don't have income. And look, when businesses go out, when they simply just go out of business, they no longer can provide a job for people. Those people now are not able to afford the things that they were purchasing, a lot of times on credit, and it has a ripple effect on the economy. Okay. So you get failed businesses. You also have a huge loss in family annual income. All right. And I'm going to give you a statistic here. And you, like I said, you don't need to remember the exact statistic, but what you do want to think about is how this would impact a family. The average family income in 1929, just prior to the stock market crash, was about $2,300 per year, which was a decent sum of money back then. All right. 3 years into the Depression, that figure had gone from about $2,300 to about $1,600. Literally, families were making 30% less income than they were just 3 years before. All right. To give you an idea of how your lifestyle would change or have to change, ask your parents what would happen if they lose 30% of their income for the next year. Right? That should give you an idea. And I can tell you right now, people would be dramatically impacted by that. So the average family income is down, the number of failed businesses down, and unemployment is up. People do not have jobs. All right. Unemployment usually it's not like in a given economy, it's not unusual to have like 4 or 5% unemployment. That's considered relatively normal. All right. You're always having people shifting around from one job to the next, or sometimes somebody gets laid off or fired. Uh, that happens. However, unemployment rates are going to skyrocket. They go from about 5% in 1929 to about 25% in 1932. That is a huge increase and it is frightening, right? Think of this 25%. One out of four able bodied adults in the workforce didn't have a job. That is cringy to say the least. Now, depending on where you went in the country, sometimes that rate got higher. I think it's Toledo, Ohio, at one point, the unemployment rate for that city was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70%, which, I mean, that in itself is a depressing statistic, no pun intended. All right. So Herbert Hoover, as president, he's got all kinds of problems. He made the bad decisions to contract the money supply and put in tariffs in place. He made bad decision with the bonus army. He's got all these depression statistics that he's expected to come up with solutions for. Right. This is not a good time to be in the United States. But look, we're not done. There's other problems that are affecting us here in the Depression era. Okay, because so many people lost their homes, they were unable to pay for their mortgages anymore. They became homeless, and homeless people decided that what they would do is try to create their own little shack towns in various locations, much like what the Bonus Army did. And out of a sense of mockery, they called them Hoovervilles. All right. And this is what a Hooverville looked like. It's a little shack town that people basically would just set up in the middle of nowhere that's on public property or in a nearby park. And they would live together or at least around one another to try to make it, to try to survive. And these little shack towns you see here, these Hoovervilles, you have to realize this is absolute desperation for people. This is not a safe place. These places do not have running water. They probably don't have any real electricity. Maybe they've got a lamp, an oil lamp of some kind, but you don't have the modern amenities that people were necessarily interested in that time frame. And so these are also places that the police really didn't want to go because it's a homeless town. And not only that, there's no sanitary conditions. So you imagine like the smell would be pretty disgusting. And it's not an environment people want to go in. And at nighttime, it's really dark, it's unsafe. And if you were living in a Hooverville, you'd pretty well hit rock bottom, right? And the Hoovervilles, though, like I said, it's just one of many ways they mocked Herbert Hoover. Um, if, for instance, they verbalized Hoover's name in a lot of ways. If you Hooverize on something, it means you make do with what you got. Like one way you could Hooverize was if you had only half a gallon of milk and you needed a little bit more, you poured some water into the milk and water it down. You're Hooverizing, meaning you're trying to make do with what you got. Okay, stretch it out as long as you can. Or if you turn your pockets inside out and it looks like little white flags, you said you were waving your Hoover flags because you got empty pockets. So the Hoovervilles are really not good places. You can see here that kids trying to entertain themselves just run around like you got a bunch of barefoot children who they don't have anything to do, and it's basically a lot of times these are organized in not sanitary conditions. You see right here, you got a bunch of men basically getting around a little location, a little tin trash can, and trying to build a fire and keep warm. Uh, this also, the depression had a worse effect on men than women. And you have to remember, in this time frame, women were always expected to be stay-at-home moms and just a good, dutiful wife, whereas men were supposed to be the people who earned money. And for men, this is a dramatic. It shatters their identity, so to speak. And they're like, I can't provide for my family. A lot of men just up and leave their wives. They turn to alcohol. Sometimes they become abusive. It's an ugly scenario. I do like this picture right here. It makes me laugh a little bit in a tough time. You can see there these two little boys are sitting out in front of Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. And basically, it's like, we don't have any money. We used to be tobacco farmers, uh, and please give us whatever money you can. And then at the bottom, there's a sign that says, hard times are still hoovering over us. Come on, you got to like the clever nature. That's very punny. Okay. Now, if that wasn't enough, if the Hoovervilles, the failed banks, the failed businesses, the high unemployment, if that wasn't enough, we got another massive problem. All right. There is a terrible phenomenon out in the Midwest called the Dust Bowl. All right. And you can see in this picture, the Dust Bowl is an area of the country that gets hit by these massive dust storms, right? And you can see right here, like you get a sense of the scale because you can see people in the picture, and you not only see people in the picture, but the houses, and you get a sense of how vast and immense these dust storms are. And so, hopefully, the question you should be asking yourself is, well, where do these dust storms come from? And it was kind of a freak occurrence out there on the plains of the Midwest where the Dust Bowl is. And let me show you a map here. You can see in the Midwest, the red and the off red, yellowish areas, those are the areas that are hit hardest by these dust storms. But the Dust Bowl itself goes throughout the entire Midwest. And this is a lot of flat, plain area where a lot of farming occurs. All right. And so the Dust Bowl phenomenon comes from this Midwestern area. And what happens is you had a combination of drought, several years of drought, all right. And on top of that, on top of the drought, you had bad farming practices where they were continually tilling the soil, which loosened up the soil. So, loosened up soil, a drought, natural wind that occurs in this area makes for these massive windstorms that you see back there. Okay. And once again, these massive windstorms are become dirt storms, and you can see that they can be several miles high and hundreds of miles long. It's a disturbing thing because it crushes farmland at a time where people don't have jobs and they desperately need food. These dust storms are coming in and crushing the crops that are out there. And to give you an idea, in this Dust Bowl area, especially those reddened areas in Oklahoma and Kansas, uh, those areas, you had an average of one dust storm per month for something like 5 or 6 years, and people can't tolerate it. It's absolutely dreadful. This is an example of the aftermath of what happens in the Dust Bowl. Right? Can you imagine that? Instead of, like, how we had, I mean, when you get excited when there's piles of snow, and even when you get tired of it, it's going to melt away. But in this case, in this particular situation, farmers out in the Midwest have to dig their way out, and that dust and debris gets in everything. No matter how much you tried to shield, or no matter how much you tried to shield your house from it, people would try to gum up their windows and block it off and cover up their doorways, etc. But the dirt gets in there, it gets in your food. It's just dreadful, and people would get sick from it. They would even develop dust pneumonia, and basically, you ever get for lack of a better term, you get a lot of phlegm and you want to hawk up something out of your lungs. Imagine that combined with dirt. And literally, people would get sick and die from dust pneumonia just because they couldn't get away from these dust storms. Now, one other weird thing, too. Uh, have you hopefully asked yourself this? Why are people, like, notice that people are outside in this picture? And why are people taking pictures of this dirt storm? Why are they not running for safety? Okay. Why would they take pictures of this? Is it just to document it, to be like, wow, And the answer is no. Okay. The reason they had to take pictures of this is because the government back in Washington, D.C., didn't believe that the dust storms were that bad. They couldn't understand why. And so farmers had to take pictures. It's that dramatic. Now, you're going to watch a little video sometime this week about the Dust Bowl, but one of the things we want to mention about it too, a famous novel comes out of this era about the Dust Bowl. A guy by the name of John Steinbeck writes a famous novel called The Grapes of Wrath, and it's about a family that moves from Oklahoma out to California because of the Dust Bowl and the circumstances and the Depression. And John Steinbeck, you may have had to read some of his stuff in English classes. This book will depress the bejesus out of you. Okay, The Grapes of Wrath, and it deals with the phenomenon. Believe it or not, I'll go back to the map for a second too. You can see that Oklahoma is one of the states hardest hit by this, and you can see that the states with the dashed lines in them, they are losing population because a lot of people don't want to stick around to try to work these farms when the dust storms seem to keep coming forever and ever. All right. And so Oklahomans in particular went out west because they said, well, we have farming skills, we can go work there. And literally in California, so many people from Oklahoma went out to California that they started calling everybody who came out there an Okie. And the Grapes of Wrath is about an Okie family. And even if you weren't from Oklahoma, that's what they still called you. All right. So the depression is depressing for a number of ways. And we'll pick up with that later, kiddos.